A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's hard to think of another slasher franchise that covers so much ground, dipping and diving into some very unique narratives tied together with the ghost of a burned man. Despite arguably inconsistent quality and admittedly some pretty bad installments, there's a lot to talk about when critiquing these films. This video will be covering the 7 main installments and the 2010 remake of the original film. Freddy vs. Jason is a more complex case since it's also a Friday the 13th film, so it'll be left out. Before we get to that though, it's important to have a basic understanding on the history of American slasher films and discussions around these films. I'll first begin by defining the relevant time period I'm looking at, which is Golden Age American slasher films, meaning slasher films that were released between the years 1978 and 1984, which would start with the original Halloween and end with Friday the 13th, the final chapter. This period is where these types of films received the most critical praise and box office success until the mid-90s and new 10s. American horror films before Halloween in the 60s and 70s have loose associations with each other and were influenced by Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, Italian giallo or yellow crime films, among other works. Films that have many of the qualities of what is considered a slasher film during this period are commonly referred to as proto-slashers. This is because Halloween, by being so popular, inspired rather specific story structures and writing. Thus, Golden Age American slasher films would have more in common with Halloween than the films that came before, although that doesn't preclude other influences so much as makes them a secondary to the main influence. To clarify, the common elements of this period of slashers is a focus on teenagers in normal settings such as high schools, suburban homes, or campgrounds, a killer seeking some form of retribution for a past incident, very large body counts with a high focus on gore effects, explicit and often gratuitous displays of sex and nudity, and a final person surviving an onslaught against the killer before emerging victorious, sometimes with a teaser for a sequel at the end. Now, when looking at any of these films in specific, these elements can become more complex, as even the most stereotypical works of the genre have some subversion from a more broad classification. For instance, Michael Myers in the original Halloween does not have any real motivations beyond being a personification of evil, and the film has very little gore. However, I bring up these specific elements due to them being commonly referenced and re-referenced with both retrospective analysis of the genre and commentary within meta-slasher films such as Scream, The Cabin in the Woods, and The Final Girls. Specifying a bit further, let's focus on that final person against the killer more. This is a concept commonly referred to as the final girl. To quote directly from Men, Women, and Chainsaws, Gender in the Modern Horror Film by Carol J. Clover, where the term final girl originated from. The one character of stature who does live to tell the tale is in fact the final girl. She is introduced at the beginning and is the only character to be developed in any psychological detail. We understand immediately from the attention paid it that hers is the main storyline. She is intelligent, watchful, level-headed, the first character to sense something amiss, and the only one to deduce from the accumulating evidence the pattern and extent of the threat. The only one, in other words, whose perspective approaches our own privileged understanding of the situation. We register her horror as she stumbles on the corpses of her friends. Her momentary paralysis in the face of death duplicates those moments of the universal nightmare experience, in which she is the undisputed I, on which horror frankly trades. When she downs the killer, we are triumphant. She is by any measure the slasher film's hero. This is not to say that our attachment to her is exclusive and unremitting, only that it adds up, and that in the closing sequence, which can be quite prolonged, it is very close to absolute. Reading the entirety of Men, Women, and Chainsaws, if you have the time, is worth it if you're interested in more information, but understanding at least this basic history of what shaped this period of American slasher films, the general formula of these films, and the ideas underlining the concept of the final girl is enough to start discussing what sets the Nightmare on Elm Street films apart. So, let's begin with A Nightmare on Elm Street, the film. Directed by the late Wes Craven, this is probably one of my favorite films. The cast is great, the sets are great, it's interesting and effective at being a fun horror film. Released in November of 1984, A Nightmare on Elm Street came after the end of the Golden Age of slashers, and featured a focus on psychological drama and special effects. Technically speaking, it would be considered part of the Golden Age due to how iconic it ended up becoming, but I'll be arguing that it represents a large shift away from the ideas in prior films and should be considered on its own terms instead. Let's observe the overall design and how, well, tactile it is. The sequels certainly have impressive effects, but what they often lack is a sense of realism in their locales. The popcorn walls, the lighting, a lot of it can be attributed to the low budget, but it all comes together to make a film that feels realistic. Moreover, the sets of the dreams looking similar to reality creates a sense of ambiguity to them, since there's times where you really don't know if someone is dreaming or not. With that noted, let's focus on the hook, or I guess glove, of the series. A serial killer who only exists in dreams. This is very different from the villains who came before Freddy, who often metaphorically embody pure evil, but were generally required to be somewhat realistic in their physical limitations. They might survive to haunt again, but they'll still be stunned from bullets, blunt objects, etc. Freddy only existing in dreams means he can't be harmed in any significant way, a fact he gloats about constantly. It also means that it's possible for a character to survive an attack from him and still have a lot of conflict on figuring out how to stop him in the future, creating drama from the inevitability of sleep. This means the series is never required to be defined by body counts and allows the characters to have a greater degree of complexity, further reinforced of us seeing their dreams, which gives us insight to who they are as a person a little bit. Let's note the goat in Tina's first dream. The script doesn't specify where the goat originates from, so it's possible that Tina is simply afraid of goats, and Freddy uses one to scare her. We aren't exactly seeing things from Tina's point of view in terms of film language, but since every dream is entirely a subjective experience, we are in part anchored to that character and their emotions. It's a pretty subtle difference from stalking kill sequences in other slashers, and that's not to say those ones don't also reinforce empathy towards their victims, since they often do. But this difference in general framework is still important to note because it's creating more room to understand a victim's perspective rather than a killer's. Later, when Nancy sees Tina's body both in real life and in television, she starts having dreams where Tina is subjected to incredibly bizarre and morbid things. Seeing your friend dead is a very scary thing, and my interpretation is that real fears are being exploited by Freddy in order to create fear of Freddy, amplifying the control he has over his victims' situations. Outside of the dreams, apathy is present within the characters' home lives. When Tina first wakes up, for example, her mom comes to check on her, and seeing her gown torn to shreds, simply replies,
"Hey, honey, you gotta cut your fingernails, you gotta stop that kind of dreaming. One or the other."
Her thoughts on the matter are basically to ignore Tina's problems, treating something psychological as a mild inconvenience that she can fix with a little effort. Granted, the explanation that a guy is trying to kill you in a dream sounds fairly ridiculous, but that fact alone, the absurdity of that idea, is what allows Freddy to get away with even more things, making it even harder to stop him. Tina is murdered in a way that is basically impossible to explain using realistic logic, yet Rod is still blamed for her death, and both him and Glenn are able to be picked off due to the adults willingly choosing to not listen to their kids. So why do they not listen? Is it just apathy, or do they care about their kids? This is when we should discuss intergenerational trauma. This is trauma that starts in one generation that is then transferred to the next due to coping mechanisms that can be harmful. Nancy's mother Marge, for instance, continually denies Nancy's reality because she was one of many parents who burned Freddy alive when he was let free of child murder on a technicality. To her and the other parents, things have to be okay because of the horrific thing that had to be done to make things okay, and as Nancy points out,
"Or maybe I should grab that bottle and veg out with you. Avoid everything happening to me by just getting good and loaded."
the way Marge copes is very internal. She doesn't like to seek out help for the issues in her family, which leads to her extreme alcoholism, a divorce, and literally locking Nancy inside their house under the notion that this is what Nancy needs, despite Nancy's claims on the contrary. Note how Marge treats her addiction. She hides it from Nancy, despite it ruining both of their lives. This is where Freddy's power comes from. This fear of the ghost of him allows him to proliferate after death and ruin the lives of the people he affected. Basically, this means the horror is originating from darkness that is hidden by familiar circumstances, and the isolating effects suburban life can have when dealing with personal problems. It's not a coincidence Freddy attacks his victims in lifeless streets, boiler rooms underneath schools and houses. He is a manifestation of what Springwood is ignoring, the deep collective trauma everyone shares. All of this makes Nancy's struggles very relatable, and combined with the strong writing, makes her a very smart and resourceful character who isn't able to be broken by Freddy.
I'm into survival.
She's not only able to avoid him multiple times, she also figures out how to bring him into reality and plans ahead to try to get rid of him for good. But even with all that, it isn't enough. Freddy can't be beaten with violence because it's what created his power in the first place. To discuss the film's perspective on religion for a minute, Wes Craven was a former Baptist, and a lot of how he grew up ended up influencing the films he created. To quote directly from Wes Craven, the man and his nightmares, "I don't think there's any way all that stuff couldn't have had an immense impact on every facet of my life, frankly. Certainly the descent into hell, or Hades, hell's Greek mythology counterpart, was intentional with Freddy. I didn't think of him as saint so much because his antagonism is more localized to something the parents did, and he takes revenge on their children, which again was biblical, with regards to the sins of the parents being visited on their children. Nancy is frequently shown turning to religion for support against her nightmares, most notably when Freddy first tries to enter her dream, and she also recites Lay Me Down to Sleep when she goes to sleep to confront him directly. Sins of the father, as it were, is generally overcome with devout faith, but I would argue that this film is taking a different perspective on the concept. What ultimately defeats Freddy isn't violence or appealing to a higher power. Taking her mother's advice and Glenn's note on the Balinese way of dreaming, Nancy realizes that Freddy is nothing and takes back the power she gave him by believing in a myth.
I take back every bit of energy I gave you. You're nothing.
She does the exact thing you're not supposed to do in a horror film, turn your back and ignore the killer, and it works. Nancy taking back her power gives her a beautiful dream, where everything is normal and she's able to be happy. While her mom and a lot of her friends really did die, this is a really nice statement against the effects of trauma, that you can reclaim your own narrative and can move beyond it. Of course, that's not the ending we actually got, even though it should have been and was filmed. Due to studio pressure, the ending makes it all pointless and Freddy is still present, because we need to set up a sequel to a movie that didn't necessarily require one. This reverses the meaning of the film, making it argue that actually, you can escape trauma, so I'm not a huge fan of that or the cheap doll they collapse into a window. It's so great. Despite what the ending became, though, this is a very effective film, with a lot of subtextual layers to read into, and a degree of emotional and narrative intelligence that is overall rare for the subgenre. I almost feel weird to say it, but yeah, this is a classic for a reason, and its success gave some new life to slashers even as they continued to decline. Freddy's Revenge came out less than a year after the first movie, which honestly for slashers isn't that unusual. What ended up being unusual was, well, what we got. As opposed to the first movie where Freddy is haunting a group of teenagers, in this one he's only haunting one character, Jesse, and wants to possess him so he can effectively be reborn. There's also a lot of house possession stuff and some pretty overt gay themes in here. I want to start by discussing Jesse with Clover's final girl framework, as he fits most of the definition. He's introduced at the beginning, he's developed in psychological detail, he is definitely the main storyline, and his horror seeing the corpses duplicates the universal nightmare experience. There's a few significant deviations from this worth noting, though. Jesse is a guy, he's the one killing people while possessed, and he doesn't down the killer, Lisa does. This is interesting, because while Lisa is an important character, she isn't focused on the same way as Jesse. In fact, we only truly see things from her perspective alone in the final 20 minutes. So, should the framework be applied to Jesse, or to Lisa? Carol does note Jesse as a potential start of final guys who fulfill most of the requirements she lays out, but as a footnote that's seeking future elaboration. So, let's take the framework and apply a different perspective to it. Culturally, Freddy's Revenge is considered one of the gayest horror films ever. That element is very much an intentional part of the text, as stated by the writer after 25 years of denials. Quote, "Homophobia was skyrocketing, and I began to think about our core audience, adolescent boys, and how all this stuff might be trickling down into their psyches at an age when raging hormones often produce dreams and urges that make them, if only unconsciously, begin to question their own sexuality," Chaskin wrote. "My thought was that tapping into that angst would give an extra edge to the horror." End quote. Through metaphor, Freddy in this film represents the conflicting notions of homosexual desire and homophobia. Jesse is repressing himself in order to conform to the society around him, and is often reprimanded or made to feel odd for doing things not considered normal. He could be the only gay teen in Springwood, And that alienation, that othering, creates a lot of fear for Freddy to use unique from anyone else in the town. I find this to be a great extension of the first movie's themes. Trauma trickling down to later generations creating apathy and resentment is still present here, but with the added notion that what is also being ignored is queerness, and how that creates apathy and resentment as well. Non-straight people exist in Springwood, but it's in the margins, and Jesse not having a community to go to often leads to him being confused and hurt. Let's look at a good example. Jesse goes to the local gay bar without being told where it is, looking for some kind of support, but is denied. Let's talk about this guy. This is Jesse's coach, Coach Schneider. He's overall a negative influence on Jesse's life, routinely demeaning and punishing him. He also frequents this local gay bar, and tells Jesse to run laps and hit the showers when he catches him trying to drink instead of just sending him home. He makes no attempt to understand why Jesse was even there, he doesn't tell Jesse's parents, and it's heavily implied he's using Jesse for his own gratification.
How much longer do you think he's gonna keep us out here?
It could be all night. The guy gets his rocks off like this. Hangs around queer S&M joints downtown.
Let's note some things about the scene where Schneider is murdered. As we watch him be dragged to the showers, stripped naked, and whipped with a towel, we also see shots of Jesse looking at him, in film language reinforcing that there's something here to pay attention to with how Jesse is reacting. Nudity is extremely rare in the Elm Street films, and this is the first scene where Freddy fully possesses Jesse to murder someone. So, I would argue that the point of this scene is Freddy's ability to frame homosexuality as something dangerous through the actions of someone real, and allows him to seize power over Jesse's life. If a man as vindictive as Schneider can exist, what's to say Jesse won't turn into that if he allows himself freedom? Jesse doesn't have a competing framework to view his own sexuality, he only has the one that Freddy forces him to see. One can only scream when confronted with fundamental contradictions into who you are and how you perceive yourself. Before going too far ahead, I do want to make a note that the concept of Coach Schneider, an older guy who is implied to be preying on young men, is a pretty terrible stereotype of actual gay men, dating back to anti-gay propaganda from the 60s and earlier, which used this constructed idea of what a quote other unquote is in order to justify real violence against the marginalized.
What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious. A sickness of the mind.
Noting the writer for Freddy's Revenge wanting an extra edge to the horror, and being aware of skyrocketing homophobia, there's the potential read that this character was added in order to deconstruct the implicit notions present in the stereotype, although I don't think it was handled very well, and more reads as a way to create fear from the concept of a gay predator, basically using the stereotype wholesale. If I were to point to an aspect of this movie that is the most dated, it would definitely be this. Moving on from that, it's important to clarify that while Jesse's feelings are what's giving Freddy power, it's also not really his fault. He didn't burn Freddy, and with minimal support from adults in his life, he doesn't have an avenue to escape his influence. In this way, the film is arguing sympathy towards young gay men and their struggles, rather than framing them as evil or wrong for having these feelings to begin with, and also notes how exploitation and abuse of them can be perpetuated through deliberate ignorance.
I just feel he needs help and we don't know how to give it to him.
Oh, come on, Cheryl.
Are you hearing me? That boy's in trouble.
No, he's not in trouble. What that boy needs is a good goddamn kick in the butt. That's what he needs.
I wish you would talk to me. You know, we can figure it out. We can figure it out together.
There is nothing to figure out.
We should now discuss Lisa a little bit. She's a very kind person who is interested in Jesse, and is also very emotionally supportive and becomes aware of the same thing that Nancy realizes, that Freddy doesn't really exist and is living off of people's fear. Through emotional connection to Lisa, Jesse is able to fight Freddy's influence, and them kissing is what drives Freddy away, which in many ways complicates the overall message of the film. Talking literally, this is a positive thing where Freddy is once again defeated by not repeating the cycle of violence, and emotionally supporting people when they're in trouble is definitely a good thing to do. I can even believe that Lisa really is romantically interested in Jesse. However, the opposite, that Jesse is romantically interested in Lisa, is rather muddied. If we take Freddy as a metaphor for repressed sexual feelings, then yes, him coming out when Jesse is making out with Lisa and being with Grady would both correlate to the same thing, that Jesse has complex feelings for these people that he lacks the ability to express. However, there's also a correlation between Jesse going to a gay bar when upset and going to Grady's when upset, due to both resulting in traumatic death. If the conclusion to this text is to kiss a girl and be freed from internal conflict, and Lisa doesn't die, does that not by effect argue in favor of repression of conflicted sexual feelings? There's a conflict between the takeaway and what the film is actually about. This metaphor starts getting rather confused because I don't think the film is aware of the potential subtext that Jesse is bisexual or pansexual, due to Jesse's sexuality itself being implicit in film language rather than stated plainly. We're not quite at a puzzle of flesh levels of explicit text yet.
Are you in love with Jocelyn?
Yeah, I think so. But I'm kind of attracted to Trevor.
Because broader American culture in the 80s was not willing to reckon with gay people as real, actual people with their own thoughts and emotions. Instead, much more willing to see them either in the margins, the abstract, or as caricatures. Something that would come to a head with the AIDS crisis before, during, and after this film's release. But that, of course, is looking back at a film with over 30 years of hindsight. I think this would summate my feelings towards the movie on the whole, because while I can see some genuinely good and unique ideas here, and cultural conversations on this film I found to be pretty insightful, the film itself is very inconsistent in its handling of its subject matter due to many complex factors. Even still, I think Freddy's Revenge is an important film with sometimes radical deviations, and an early example of what gay horror could look like at a time where little to no horror was even close to what it was doing. If the first film is a classic, I would definitely say this one's a cult classic. After Freddy's Revenge, New Line Cinema took more time for the scripting process and production for the next sequel, Dream Warriors. This resulted in a film that is more in line with the structure of the first movie, while also expanding the scope with the introduction of dream powers, with a new character Kristen notably having the ability to pull people directly into her dreams. Before getting into that, however, the first thing I want to discuss about this film is its depiction of mental health. Instead of killing his victims immediately, Freddy gets them sent to mental hospitals in order to torment them with their helplessness, building more into a mellow mass hysteria that is sustainable. This is perhaps the most empathetic writing in the series so far, with all the teens feeling close enough to real that you feel genuinely bad when Freddy picks them off one by one. Part of that is due to its more archetypal writing, where specific traits of the teens are accentuated for relatability, not unlike a John Hughes film.
In my dreams, I'm beautiful. And bad.
But this is also due to the film contrasting with adults who don't understand the kids even more than the first two films, with the medical staff varying from passive ignorance to active malevolence. Dr. Sims theorizes that the thing actually wrong with the kids is guilt from
moral conflicts and overt sexuality,
which I would argue is Sims prescribing causes to a non-matching symptom. What makes Dr. Sims great for drama is that she could work even if Freddy wasn't real, because her treatment of the kids is not only ineffective, it's actively harmful and causes them great distress. Note what she says about Kincaid.
If he continues having these outbursts, I'll have to have him isolated permanently.
Since she thinks she already knows the cause, any outburst by Kincaid is considered him working against treatment, which does nothing to help his mental health and just continues a cycle where he feels more isolated, and thus lashes out even more to be isolated even further. It's also obvious from how Kincaid reacts that he's scared. He's not a danger to other people, he's a danger to Dr. Sims's control. There's also an interesting bit with Taryn and this medical staff guy named Lorenzo. With Taryn, she is actively trying not to go back to drugs so she can get better, and Lorenzo not only pushes her to do them, but tries to use a position of authority to keep her quiet.
Now who's going to take the word of a crazy junkie chick like you?
These elements on the whole are effective writing, and stands in contrast to many films who would use mental health problems as a punchline, or as a reason to not trust somebody. Along with this, Nancy returns as a supporting character. And while she overall doesn't have as much development as the first film, the fact she is present at all and knows exactly what's going on is very interesting. This again harkens back to how Freddy being in dreams means people can know about him but still be powerless to stop him, making for effective and engaging drama. Nancy effectively serves as a big sister to Kristen and the rest of the kids, which is really nice and gives the film an interesting emotional through-line as they come to rely on her. She's also the one to motivate the Dream Warriors conceit of the film by showing how they can all stand together against Freddy rather than facing him individually.
It's not you. Your parents, my parents, they burned him alive. And now we're paying for their sins. You are the last of the Elm Street children.
There's also certain plot points that feel like a natural escalation for a sequel to take. Freddy absorbing the souls of the children to grow stronger is a perfect visual metaphor for how he sustains himself on his victim's fear. It makes him a more existential threat rather than just a physical and mental one. I'm also a fan of Nancy's father being the one to help Gordon put Freddy to rest. It's in part a redemptive act to right the violence he and the other parents enacted, and a good way to conclude his character. All that said, while on the whole the movie is a decently effective sequel to the original, with some really effective horror sequences, I do think it has a lot of issues. We'll begin with the tonal inconsistencies, in that the film can shift from being horror to comedic within the span of one line. That isn't to say humor is bad in a horror film, just that the way the film uses humor is often to its detriment in both tone and character. Let's take the scene where Jennifer is killed. Freddy emerging from a TV to shove her through it is, frankly, ridiculous, and it isn't helped with the one-liner he says before he does it.
Welcome to prime time, bitch!
Freddy was a bit of a jokester in the prior two films, but they were overall careful enough to have those jokes not be at the expense of the people he's harming. Because when you write characters that feel like real people, making them punchlines is unsatisfying and feels wrong.
It's a chair for you, kid!
The tonal inconsistencies I don't think apply to the dream powers themselves, though. Like, Will proclaiming he's the Wizard Master before dying, I read similar to the moment Nancy takes away Freddy's power. It's an attempt to reclaim their own narratives from Freddy, and sadly, not always succeeding. For a deeper issue, we can look at Amanda Krueger, Freddy's mother, whose inclusion starts the trend of the sequels trying to justify or explain why Freddy is so evil and, in part, why he's able to attack people from dreams, which I always thought was unneeded. Freddy's power exists in reaction to the state of his victims, how belief powers him, and without belief or fear sustaining him, he's nothing. It is a metaphorical threat becoming literal due to repression. This movie makes multiple steps to have Freddy's power come from a literal space. First from Amanda saying,
"The bastard son of 100 maniacs."
I really don't like this line, because Freddy being born from sexual assault doesn't explain why he's evil at all. It's associating horrific actions to him for the sake of drama. Freddy murdered children. I think that on its own is more than enough to show why he's an evil person. The other way the film literalizes is with Freddy's bones. Amanda states that Krueger must be put to rest in order for this to all stop, which assigns a religious connotation to Freddy as a devil of some sort. This plot point isn't technically a contradiction, since Sins of the Father has been a recurrent theme in every film. It just moves things away from the personal actions people take into belief in a higher power instead, which turns out to not be a solution either. One last critique. Nancy's death scene overall is pretty underwhelming and feels like it was done out of genre obligation more than anything. While I do think it's good she's able to save Kristen from Freddy, her being fooled by Freddy doesn't really make much sense considering the extent of her knowledge of both dreams and how Freddy is capable of disguising himself.
No running in the hallway.
While I completely understand Nancy's need for emotional closure of her father, I don't think she would let her guard down at all unless she knew for certain everyone was safe and out of the dream first. Looking at the original script done by Wes Craven and Bruce Wagner, we can note a lot of differences in framing and characterization. Nancy, for instance, is the main character rather than a supporting character, and during the moment where Krueger disguises himself as her father, she sees through it, yet still willingly sacrifices herself to kill him. It's also worth noting that Krueger's power is being derived from his house rather than his bones and the souls of the children, meaning a combination of Nancy attacking Freddy along with destroying his house by the collective effort of the group is what does it. Additionally, there's no mention of Amanda Krueger at all. There's parts of the script I find a lot weaker, especially a lot of the dialogue, but having Freddy's power being tied to his house gives a lot more meaning to things only suggested in the final release. Kristen continually dreams of Krueger's house not because it's a random scary location, but it's because it's where everyone is being drawn to, willingly or not. The subconscious affects the conscious, the boiler room underneath suburbia. Burning away the last things representing Freddy is what the script argues is necessary for the community to move on, paralleling Freddy's initial death. To clarify, since I often see this get muddled, Craven had no involvement in Dream Warriors beyond this first co-written draft with Bruce Wagner since he was busy filming Deadly Friend. So most of what people associate with Dream Warriors came from Frank Darabont and Chuck Russell, the director. All that said, Dream Warriors is still another unconventional sequel that on the whole does work as an effective film, with commentary in it that is still relevant today. It's just that alongside that, there's a creeping sense of commercialization, from the tie-in song, the merchandising, the jokes, to the arguable overabundance of special effects. It marks a shift away from low-budget roots to high-budget production, and with it, the series begins to be more aware of its own place in pop culture. Dream Warriors was a pretty big success both commercially and critically, and moreover gave a blueprint for subsequent films to follow with the new lore and gimmicks. If this was a dip into comedic and commercialized aspects, Dream Master turns that dip into a wade, with more elements of 80s pop culture being referenced, more songs, more jokes, exploding windows? None of these aspects are necessarily bad. Heck, I happen to like Tuesday Night songs a lot, but Dream Master to me is the closest that the franchise gets to the formula of a more traditional slasher. Something perhaps not helped by the 1988 Writers Guild of America strike, which spanned most of filming and required a few scenes to be improvised, leading to some rather infamous moments. Factoring in the circumstances of the film's production, what ended up being released is an overall decent installment. There's many things I take issue with that I can discuss in more depth later, but the core of the thing and what it's about I don't have much of a problem with. So, what's it about? Let's start by focusing on the main character of the film, Alice. Alice is introduced to us as the sister of Kristen's boyfriend Rick, and initially she seems very shy and quiet. As the film progresses though, she becomes quite possibly the most developed character in any of these films, and we develop a great understanding of her emotionally and psychologically. Let's take for example her first two daydream sequences. These are the first time we are explicitly seeing something from a main character's point of view without it actually being in a dream. It's in these we see aspects of who Alice wants to be. She imagines herself saying a cheesy pickup line to Dan, her crush.
You know, you are one major league hunk.
But in reality lacks the personal agency to pursue him. At home, when her alcoholic father chides her for not making food that he wanted, she imagines finally snapping and telling him exactly what she thinks, but of course doesn't. Combined with the implication that Alice's mother has passed away, this comes together to show a fairly realistic portrayal of the effects of grief and abuse at a young age, imagining elaborate scenarios, but too afraid of things going wrong to actually do them, withdrawing instead of expressing. This is all good setup and characterization, but it's also worth noting that while Alice is the main character, Kristen, Joey, and Kincaid also exist and are initially a focus. Sadly, for Joey and Kincaid's case, this mostly amounts to a few brief scenes of them talking with Kristen before they're killed off. It would have been nice to have them exist in the same capacity as Nancy in the prior film, people who have already gone through this situation and have learned from it, and I definitely feel there's a lot of missed potential here, but I can at least understand how having so many characters from a different work can conflict with the goals of a new story. Also, Freddy's revival in Kincaid's dream is rather confusing. Kincaid's dog Jason, hilarious reference, pees on Freddy's grave, and I suppose by effect desecrates it. But we're in a dream. This would not be his real grave. So why does this revive him? This question is actually somewhat interesting, because it illustrates a difference that was created between the first two movies and Dream Warriors that this film now has to contend with. In the first two movies, Freddy is a ghost with no permanent physicality who's defeated by giving up the belief he is real, taking power away from him. In the third, he is manifesting from his bones and giving him a proper burial is what stops him. These are two concepts that are basically incompatible, and Dream Master has to try to split the difference by having it be implied that Kristen's continued fear of Freddy is what brings him back.
Did it ever occur to you that if you keep going in, you might stir him up again?
While also showing the desecration of his grave. Maybe there should be some consideration on how this is blurring dream and reality, but I don't think it's handled very well and points to the logistics of these films becoming difficult to work around. Now, for Kristen, the film makes a few specific points on how she's the last of the Elm Street children, how her mother directly leads to her being vulnerable to Freddy by drugging her with sleeping pills without her consent.
No, Mother. You just murdered me. Take that to your goddamn therapy.
And how Kristen's ability to draw people into dreams becomes essential for Freddy to continue haunting other children. In what is arguably a pivotal moment in the series, Freddy manages to kill Kristen, and Alice's latent dream powers awaken, the ability to absorb the traits of people who die in shared dreams. The reason why this is pivotal is it changes one of the central conceits of the series. Freddy didn't just haunt people in their dreams, he haunted and murdered the children of the people who burned him alive as a sick form of retribution. Having him effectively win in this goal poses an important question. What now? If all of these people didn't stand a chance, if their parents all failed them, then what will stop Freddy? Well, it's Alice, and her growth as a person is anything but traditional for the genre. She starts as a wallflower, but as she absorbs the traits of so many other people, she grows beyond archetype. She even arguably grows beyond the definition of a final girl. She's smart, she's strong, she smokes, she knows kung fu. She has no specific traits attributable to a singular cliché representation of a teenager in media. She embodies the all. Dream Master isn't just a slasher in terms of construction, it's also a coming-of-age story where someone from a broken family learns to see what she values in life and makes definitive decisions that change her fundamentally. The conceit of the series changing, I feel, was worth it in order to continue examining problems that teenagers are dealing with. By effect, the series is passing the torch narratively and thematically.
How do you know so much about dreams?
Well, when it's all you have, you kind of become an expert.
In service of this, the supporting cast is more archetypal than even Dream Warriors. This is done to highlight traits that Alice will later absorb. For example,
mind over matter.
Mind over matter.
And in fairness, the characters themselves are overall decent and fairly likable. However, this is where the formula of a traditional slasher starts becoming an issue. Alice's character arc is very strong and interesting, but the people around her are not given the same level of complexity. While Alice is very much aware of Freddy, other people are not, and it leads to a lot of
enough with that crap! I saw it!
And a focus on, I guess, ironic set-piece deaths rather than on deeper characterization. This was already becoming an issue previously, and it's now escalating to dojos and roach motels. Granted, dreams are very bizarre, and having surreal imagery related to this isn't a bad decision in a vacuum, and the special effects themselves are pretty good, but it just becomes a problem when the only reason a character exists is to be disposed of, specifically written to justify the set piece that is being planned out for their death. Great characters are not defined by single events. They're defined by the culmination of many other moments. So if the characters in the film feel a bit flat, I would attribute it to this. But we arrive inevitably to Alice facing against Freddy. In many ways, Nancy can be considered the arch-enemy to Freddy, and we can get into that reading later with New Nightmare, but within the context of this movie and Dream Child, Alice would fit the role. The Dream Master refers to her, Freddy's absorption of souls by effect also strengthens Alice, and we can also get some interesting tidbits about two gates that a wandering soul can enter when asleep.
The key element is that there's a Dream Master, someone who guards the positive gate and in fact protects the sleeping host.
This is technically the second time dreaming is tied to spiritual aspects not related to Christianity, if we include the Balinese way of dreaming, and it's what Freddy is referring to about guarding his gate.
I've been guarding my gate for a long time.
He's so evil that he's used as a guardian of the negative gate, I suppose by effect to also bring balance with Alice as the guardian of the positive gate. It's too bad the series won't use this particular explanation in the future, but hey, one can dream, I guess. I also want to emphasize that even with a Destiny framework to this, Alice still would have tried to stop Freddy because of how he uses her to get at the people she loves. It's an arch-enemy thing and also a personal thing. Once again, Freddy can't be beaten with violence, though. Alice tries many ways and they all fail. Instead, what she does is complete the Dream Master rhyme, which she remembers in full in the last moment.
Evil will see itself.
And it shall die!
The Dream Master rhyme is an adaptation of the religious poem Nancy Said, removing the religious connotations and provides an individual solution to the problem. In the reflection of my mind's eye, evil will see itself and it shall die. Let's think about what this is saying. When we first see Alice in her room, she has her mirror covered in photos, something Rick makes a specific note of.
Sort of defeats the purpose, don't it?
What?
The mirror. You can't see yourself in it.
I don't want to.
As more people die, the mirror becomes more and more uncovered as Alice becomes stronger and stronger. She learns to perceive herself, confront her own image, and comes off stronger for it. Freddy, by contrast, is not strong in this way. He is a ghost, arguably an abstraction of who he used to be. If someone as evil as Freddy were to perceive himself, really understand the horrible things he's done to other people, it would completely destroy him. So Alice pulling a mirror out to Freddy isn't really as arbitrary as it seems. It's tied in pretty well to the overall themes of the film. The children's souls are free, Alice gets her man. Happy ending with a teaser once again. Dream Master performed rather well but received mixed reviews, and while I understand why and have made note of my own criticisms, I still find a lot of value in this one like I do for most of the series. But still, the death of the American slasher was nearing, with the end of the 80s leading to a commercial decline. The Dream Child is a very curious film. Made in the waning crescent of the franchise's popularity, it both embodies some of the series' worst tendencies and its best. Freddy continues his trend towards being goofy and hard to take seriously, resulting in some incredibly bizarre and frankly embarrassing tonal contrasts.
Told ya! Comic books was bad for ya!
However, getting past this problem, this is actually one of the more cerebral entries in the series, dealing with some pretty dark subject matter that I haven't seen any other slasher really cover. Let's start with the opening credits depicting Dan and Alice having sex. This is one of very few times in the series where sex is shown in explicit terms, and I bring this up to discuss an important critique of slashers. A critique that often exists alongside the final girl framework is sex equals death, and it's pretty simple. If you have sex in a horror movie, you die. This is often contrasted with the final girl often being virginal and living, creating a read where having sex is a transgression or sin that needs to be countered with death. This becoming a trend is due to writers continually copying elements from the original Halloween, with little thought put into the implications of that writing. This is why many later films argue against this potential implication. Scream, for instance, has sex equals death stated as a rule explicitly, and then shows Sidney having sex and surviving not only the film, but every Scream film, showing the limitation of that writing and how to move beyond it. Having sex is a normal thing to do. The real transgressive actions are voyeurism and murder. It's also something that the Dream Child is arguing against. Dan and Alice have sex, but the way it's shot isn't for the audience's benefit. It's done for explicit story reasons and to highlight the depths of cruelty and evil with Freddy. He kills Dan using Alice's power through her baby, and tries to corrupt him in order to be reborn through him. Your sympathies the entire film are with Alice. We see her struggle with Dan's death and her personal agency becoming more limited once realizing she's a teenage mother. One particularly heartbreaking moment is when she thinks she's alone at home, crying about Dan's death, and immediately once she realizes her father is back, she snaps back to a facade of being normal. She's dealing with some extremely difficult things, but still cares enough about her dad and his mental state that she doesn't want to put her feelings on him. When asking if he's disappointed in her, he says,
No. No, I'm not.
The film doesn't argue that Alice is a bad person for having sex, because she isn't a bad person. She's a good, empathetic person, trying to live her life outside of how tragedy tries to define it. I also want to make a note here of Dan's parents, where they offer to take Alice's baby and raise him, which she rejects because she feels
he's my responsibility.
Many adults in Alice's life are telling her how to act and behave, despite her telling them what she wants and needs. None of them understand the threat Freddy poses like she does, and she has to rely on her friends instead. That series throughline, how adults often fail children, is still very much present here, and like before, it creates conflicts that lets Freddy seize power. Along with this, the supporting cast is overall stronger than Dream Master. They're still written to some extent with archetypes in mind, but they help Alice with the unfolding mystery and what Freddy is doing, and contribute to the series' overall themes. In fact, this film only has 3 people die in total, which is lower than even the original movie, because so much more time was put into developing them rather than introducing them for an effects death, which, well, still happens. Let's take Greta as an example. Greta has an extreme eating disorder caused by continual abuse from her mother, which Freddy exploits in order to murder her. The only time her mom shows genuine concern for her as a person and not a doll to parade around at parties is when she's already dead. This points to how body image issues often form due to abuse and the isolating effects of that abuse. Look at Greta's room. She's continually surrounded by what her mom wants her to be, with no say on her part in what she wants to be. It's extremely sad, and I feel genuinely bad when she's killed. It's also notable that the thing that helps stop Krueger this time, putting Amanda's spirit to rest, is done by Alice's friend Yvonne and not Alice directly. Alice and by extension her son Jacob do need to fight off Freddy's influence at the end, but that can only happen with Yvonne's help, which is interesting since Yvonne spends the majority of the film in denial of Krueger's existence until she herself is attacked. Maybe it's a bit strange to have a skeptical character so late in the series, but the way it's handled here as opposed to a later entry is to show the reality Krueger is continually intruding on. Alice isn't just defined as the rival of Freddy, she's defined as a person with hopes, dreams, and friends that care about her. Yvonne's skepticism is coming from a place of concern rather than dismissal.
I am your friend and I'm worried sick about you. That's why it's time for you to leave the Twilight Zone and face reality.
Krueger is reality.
So is your baby. You got something more to think about than just yourself.
What do you think I'm doing?
However, as usual, there's a few criticisms that are worth noting. Let's take the film's depiction of mental health. I already noted the sympathetic portrayals both Greta and Alice got, but seeing as Amanda Krueger is a focus once again, the issues pertaining to the writing of her sexual assault are brought to the forefront, this time with Alice embodying this event firsthand through dreams, although mercifully we are not shown anything explicit. The framing of the scene is to instill fear of people with mental health issues on part of the viewer, which is part of a pretty complex trend of negative depictions of mental health in horror media, as I alluded to before in Dream Warriors. This overarching topic is a bit too complicated to discuss here in its entirety, but we can point once again to Halloween for a relevant example. You'll recall that I brought up Michael Myers as, quote, a personification of evil, unquote, in the intro, which is true textually with his superhuman ability to recover from mortal wounds, alongside his mysterious and ghostly disappearance at the end of the film. However, this framing is not neutral, and Michael Myers being a mental health patient who escapes to go on a rampage was already a stale writing device by the time the film came out, as noted by Pauline Kael in a contemporary review. Since the framing and writing is reinforcing Michael as emotionless and pure evil, we never get a sense of a person with potential subjectivity of their own. In this sense, Michael is a figure to fear and not a person to understand. This specific type of framing is also present here in The Dream Child. Take this long shot of mental health patients in a gigantic room, making noise and moving in strange ways. The idea being to have the viewer be briefly lost in the chaos. The film does somewhat imply through dialogue and framing that the overarching issue is with the management of the facility being maliciously incompetent, with a guard shown counting the patients like cattle and leaving Amanda behind, but the primary focus in the aesthetic details on the patients and not the staff being a threat, which only serves to demonize real-life people who have gone through similarly abusive circumstances, which is at odds with the much more nuanced and complicated depictions of mental health within Dream Warriors and The Dream Child itself, as I've discussed before. Potentially, this subject could have been used to explore the history of abuse and trauma being suppressed, but it never properly coalesces into the text itself. I understand the intent of the scene I described is to create sympathy with Amanda and the tragedy of her circumstances, and I can see how this correlates to later events in the plot with Alice realizing the importance of laying Amanda to rest. I can even understand a read in which this scene is entirely constructed by Freddy in order to create fear for Alice, which I believe was also the intent. However, I still think the movie would have been much better off if this scene was cut, as this is an extremely sensitive topic the film fails to frame properly. On a much less serious note, the logistics of Freddy's revival are once again pretty confusing, this time implying Freddy brought back Amanda's restless spirit in order to be reborn through Alice.
You brought me back to give you life, but now I must take yours.
Looking at one of the available scripts for the movie, this explanation appeared to be a late addition, since what she's supposed to be referring to is when he was first born, and not being brought back by him or whatever. Perhaps during filming they realized there wasn't any explicit justification and came up with this on the fly. Similar to Freddy's Revenge, this film came out less than a year after the prior installment, and this rushed production cycle is rather evident, which probably contributed to the weirdness. For me, I just read it as Freddy's power being absorbed by Alice at the end of the last film, allowing him to seize control once given an opportunity, and thus leading to Amanda responding in turn. It's rough, but it can be read coherently despite the execution. While we're on it, Freddy having the weird long arm was initially to indicate how he hasn't fully come back yet, but it seems that idea was changed as production progressed and ends up being an inconsistent detail as well.
It's my new look. Like it?
The film's execution of its ideas is inconsistent and confused in priorities. The usage of gothic imagery is quite interesting, and the nuanced character drama is surprisingly sophisticated. However, this is also the same movie with extremely loud, attention-grabbing set pieces that are a complete tonal and narrative whiplash, which, while sometimes evocative and dreamlike in aesthetically interesting ways, are oftentimes a detriment. The contrast between the series' commercialization and the narrative's priorities are in their strongest conflict, one wanting extravagance for marketing purposes, while the other wanting to create additional meaning and depth to an already pretty well-liked series. Needless to say, this led to The Dream Child often being considered a disaster. However, I once again find a lot of value in this entry, and feel more frustrated with its execution than anything. It is certainly the weakest of the first 5 films, but I would still recommend it. There's ideas here that are worth considering, and Lisa Wilcox's performance is easily one of the all-timers for the genre. The Dream Child didn't do very well commercially, so New Line Cinema decided that the next one would be the last, which, well, that was a lie since it's always a lie. To make this last entry, they decided to discard everything introduced from the third film on. We open with the last Elm Street child, who was Kristen but is now this guy. However, there's still some mentions of the other films as Easter eggs, so it makes the continuity rather confusing. It at the very least means Alice and Yvonne survived the series, which is definitely a good thing, but it also just feels disjointed and strange, right? Here's the big finale to maybe 2 of the 5 movies. I'll be upfront, I enjoyed this movie quite a lot, but I don't really enjoy it as a work that I can take seriously so much as schlock. A lot of it is rather goofy to the detriment of the characters, and when it does shift towards exploring extremely serious topics like sexual assault, abuse, and the effects of trauma, it doesn't work at all. The tonal contrasts are completely out of control, and no matter how extreme the situations, characters continually undermined with morbid humor with no regard for how that would read. As art with any particular meaning, it's almost entirely eclipsed by how commercialized and sterile the whole thing's become. Even the resolution to the plot is in contrast to what the original was saying. Rather than stopping the cycle of violence by not participating in it, it instead argues that actually all you need to do to kill Freddy again is drag him out of a dream and blow him up, despite Nancy literally lighting him on fire and it not working. But, despite the film's best efforts, there's still things to note on what it's saying. This was the film, after all, that explained Krueger's backstory, how his life was defined by abuse, leading to serial killing and 3 dream demons, what?
Then open up!
And you shall be
forever!
So why show this, and why show he has a daughter? Well, reading it cynically, it's a way to create some cheap drama and intrigue by having Maggie figure out she's his daughter and getting mad that he killed her mother.
You killed my mother!
It also gives very loose justification for the film's existence by providing lore that didn't necessarily need to exist. However, giving the film a small amount of credit, I think there's a deeper read to this. Showing Freddy as a person who suffered from abuse and had struggles is not antithetical to him being a monster, it just shows what truly makes him different from his victims. Unlike Nancy, Jesse, Kincaid, Kristen, Alice, Maggie, and so on, Freddy turns to imitating terrible behavior he sees rather than fighting against it, and uses his past to justify his horrific actions. It doesn't particularly matter to him how his daughter feels, because he never saw anyone in his life as a person, so thorough his acts of dehumanization have become. After all,
every town has an Elm Street.
Every town has an Elm Street. Every town has a boiler room. Every town has trauma that isn't expressed that can kill people. Freddy is just one face to multifaceted trauma. One can even read the film as arguing for found family rather than biological family, since Maggie receives support from the people close to her in her life rather than her abusive father, something she shares in common with Tracy. This continues the series' overall themes of failed parents, and although I think introducing Freddy's daughter is pretty unnecessary, the film is trying to say something here. Poorly, desperately, the film concludes that you should reject abuse and the people perpetrating it and move on. Your past doesn't define who you are, only you do.
Freddy's dead.
This movie's existence is a bit baffling, but it's the sort of baffling that can only really exist from this series, so I can still appreciate it on that metric alone. Still, though, it's not an effective ending to what came before. In what is perhaps the sharpest right turns in any franchise, Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Directed by the late Wes Craven, this is probably one of my favorite films. The cast is great, the sets are great, it's interesting and effective at being a fun horror film, with precise omissions and changes to get the series back to what's strongest. Nancy returns, in a sense, and Freddy retreats to the shadows with few if any jokes. Perhaps most precedent, however, is its meta angle. Wes Craven's New Nightmare is fictional. This is true literally, the majority of film is fictional storytelling, but also textually. Wes Craven is the director and writer, but he also plays himself writing the film being watched in an attempt to keep the demon who Freddy represents at bay. Nancy, or perhaps she's Heather Langenkamp, even finds the script and ends the film reading it to her child.
There was no movie. There was only her life.
The series is present as fiction within the movie, with many references to the original film and where things will go from here.
Is Freddy really dead?
Of course he is. Freddy's dead and gone.
Craven's works often reflect and push against the common trends of the genre he works in. The original Nightmare on Elm Street argued for the humanity of its victims and gave them narrative agency rarely allotted to a subgenre so enamored by the echoes of Halloween. We not only understand Nancy as unbreakable and smart, but the world in which she exists in, the ways in which her society fails to help her. When the sequels rolled around, in many ways they existed as reflections of the original, rearranging the structure and providing different perspectives, but the same core of good versus evil. Why this story retold again and again? Why this person as the icon? And why is victims overshadowed? The literal answer, of course, is commodification, to wring an idea dry until the very idea becomes tired, to continue to give reasons to sell more Freddy action figures or whatever. The textual answer, which New Nightmare provides, is more human. We tell stories to understand the world, develop empathy, and become more thoughtful, and not being obfuscated by commercial prospects can bring great harm. Freddy isn't real, but the ideas and evil he represents very much exists. Having Freddy affect a reality close to our own isn't just a gimmick, it's a reaffirmation of what the original was always about, repackaged in a meta framework to make it more obvious. Dreams and reality, films and reality. Wes Craven started the series based on people really dying in their sleep, and many elements were directly inspired by both dreams and reality. Here he is again, having nightmares and writing a script in a film. Reality in the film is blurred between both fiction and dreams to show how they interrelate and influence each other. Heather Langenkamp playing herself and Nancy shows the complexities of being not yourself, playing somebody else, and how people only seeing who you play can lead to extreme parasocialism. A major subplot in the film is Heather being afraid of a stalker, based on a real incident where Heather and her family were stalked by a fan of Just the 10 of Us angry about the show being cancelled, which is a horrifying thing for anyone to have to deal with. Films may be fiction, but they're still reflective of true things about the culture they're created in. How characters are treated matters, and can have genuine effects on the people portraying them. Having the fictional child murderer as the icon of your series matters, and it's why Nancy is such a focus now as Freddy's archetypal rival. Instead of arguing evil will always win, Wes Craven's New Nightmare posits that every evil has its other side. Someone who fights against it and argues against the values evil represents.
You were the first to humiliate him, defeat him.
That was Nancy, Wes. It's not me.
Yeah, but it was you that gave Nancy her strength.
The recurring theme of the series is how parents fail their children and how that leads to them being hurt and killed. In this movie, Heather loses her husband to Freddy and has to defend her kid all on her own while everyone around her sees her as a nutcase, while the world around her crumbles due to earthquakes. Her and her son aren't believed because contending with what they're saying would mean admitting there is something deeply wrong in the society they live in. All this makes Heather's struggles very relatable, and combined with the strong writing, makes her a very smart and resourceful character who isn't able to be broken by Freddy, who isn't able to be broken by her society. Heather steps into an archetypal role at the behest of the inevitable writing, but also because she is a good person who would defend the people she loves regardless of the situation. She represents everything Freddy is not. New Nightmare echoes the original in many ways, but it doesn't replicate its compromise ending, instead having it be a definitive and conclusive one where Freddy is forever trapped within the loop the film provides. It's the ending the series deserves, an empathetic coda that reclaims the narrative for the series' victims rather than its killer. So, wow, I really wish I could have ended with talking about New Nightmare. A deep, complicated, and interesting film meditating on its own medium with strong writing, directing, and emotional core. What if the last film I was covering was none of that? A Nightmare on Elm Street, the remake. Done in the wake of a string of remakes of older horror films, the 2010 Elm Street is the one I rewatched the least. In fact, it's been over 5 years since I've seen it last due to my dislike of it. Throughout this video, I've tried to be fair and see the value of each entry, and my overall opinion of the series has improved over time, but this one on rewatch I think is as bad as when I first saw it, and I find very little redeeming value in it. I find it to be a lifeless, factory-made product designed simply to cash in on a brand without any understanding of what it was readapting, and is bar none the worst entry in the series. To discuss it requires comparisons to the original, because while it does change quite a few things, many of its most exciting moments are derived directly from the original. It's also quite a bit more violent, but it's lacking quite a bit in terms of being tactile. In most ways, the film reduces the visual elements of the original to just brief iconography, things to remind you of it without doing anything interesting with them. Nancy sees Tina's body in a micronap, but there's never a point where she sees her real body before this, never experiences that universal nightmare experience, which makes this shot feel incredibly strange and random in a way that is not true in the original. Let's look at two key scenes to illustrate this further. First is the scene where Freddy is first shown to haunt Nancy. In the original, he haunts Nancy while she's at Tina's house with no lights on. The special effects artist simply used a fake ceiling and some spandex, but the effect is still genuinely evocative. It also ends with the implication that Nancy's faith warded him off, which would build into later themes. In the remake, Nancy's in her home not supporting Tina, the lights are on, and the effect is entirely CGI, which not only looks pretty bad, but is in a sequence that is shot and edited worse as well, cutting to angles that makes the whole thing look even more artificial than it already is. The remake's removal of that religious subtext, aside from maybe one line, reduces the scene into being filler, rather than establishing key details that'll become relevant later.
And now I lay me down to sleep. I pray the Lord my soul to keep.
For a second example of this prevailing writing issue, Nancy's school dream is mostly given to Tina with no real progression to it. It just stays in a classroom and then she wakes up. Most notably, Tina herself did nothing to get out of the dream. It was only by Freddy sparing her temporarily that she escaped. In the original, it's a multi-stage process of various smaller scares building to Nancy's first encounter of Krueger, where she escapes through her quick thinking. She saves herself from Krueger. She takes control back from Krueger. Krueger does not choose to spare her. On that note, the remake's character writing is a massive downgrade, which frequently resorts in seemingly nonsensical actions and a lack of any real emotional depth. Nancy's writing in the original is consistent and clear. She isn't acting like a stock horror character at all, which is why she endures. In the remake, instead of a character defined by her agency, this Nancy is rather shy and reactive, and is defined more by how she's treated rather than how she acts, which is less effective narratively, and leads to long stretches where she's waiting for the plot to happen to her instead of creating plot with her actions. Since Nancy never goes to support Tina when she's having troubling nightmares, Jessie just runs to where she's staying and tells her what happened instead, which gives Nancy less to do for the sake of adaptation compression, even though the same plot beats essentially still happen. Why shift events to be experienced by different characters if all it does is weaken everyone's writing? Nancy only starts learning about the elementary school and putting connections together because Freddy shows her in a long con to manipulate her into eventually falling into a coma, once again reducing her narrative agency into being a pawn. Heck, how does she escape a hospital? Well, Quentin helps her escape, off-screen. We don't see it. How did they escape? Speaking of, oh boy, Quentin. In terms of writing, Quentin creates conflict by often arbitrarily not believing Freddy is guilty and still alive in dreams, choosing to ignore any evidence until he personally is attacked. Unlike Yvonne's reactions, which were based on genuine concern for Alice, Quentin acts extremely dismissive towards what Nancy is saying, which doesn't make sense considering 3 people he knows have died from strange circumstances. Perhaps this can be understood as him being in denial and repressing his trauma, but I think it's more likely written this way because the creators wanted to show Freddy being burned alive in order to eventually have a twist where, surprise, Freddy was guilty the entire time, and needed to write in a dream sequence where this twist could be set up. Basically, it's writing from the conclusion of the story backwards, which doesn't really work when the entire premise of this series is a clearly evil man killing people in dreams. Like, you expect us to believe for a moment this guy, doing this stuff, is in any way innocent and Nancy is just having delusions? That's nonsensical. So that's all not great, but it gets significantly worse once contending with what new elements the film introduces. And we'll need to discuss the very heavy subject matter of childhood sexual assault, so please mind the content warning. For the original film, Craven wanted Krueger to be a child molester rather than a child killer, but this was changed in order to not be read as exploitative. The remake takes that original discarded idea and gives it a greater presence. Now I want to be clear, with this type of subject matter, you need to be extremely careful handling it in a way that is empathetic to the characters being victimized, and is not dismissive to the real people who have experienced this trauma. The film Fire Walk With Me shows abuse and sexual assault in explicit terms while being critical of the systems that allowed for that to happen, and centers the perspective of the victim, Laura Palmer, a high schooler, instead of the perpetrator. We see how Laura feels about her situation, what she learns about it, and ultimately how she escapes it. Fire Walk With Me is deeply empathetic towards victims of abuse and doesn't show suffering for its own sake. With this remake, none of that really applies. We rarely have an understanding of Nancy. In fact, we know more about her abuser than her. and anything related to her being sexually assaulted is shown from a very exploitative lens rather than a compassionate one. We are meant to relate to Nancy's perspective, but the filmmaking does a very poor job at reinforcing her perspective. It's extremely serious subject matter the movie fails to handle with any tact at all, and it ultimately ends with her abuser living to torment her another day. The last nail in a coffin full of horrible decisions. I rarely rewatch this film, and I think this will be the last time, because I see little if any redeeming value in it. It's a cruel and poorly made thing, made without the consent of any of the original creators, that is only talked about because it bears the name of a better work, when it really deserves to be forgotten. To summarize my feelings towards the series on the whole, A Nightmare on Elm Street is a very interesting slasher franchise that reflects on and challenges many of the conventions taken for granted in the subgenre. Instead of arguing for a continual cycle of violence where a killer is defeated by brute force only to rise again, the series argues that dealing with existential threats requires alternate means in order to cope with them, be that personal agency or agency derived from spiritual means. The series moves the subgenre beyond simply copying from past genre successes into new territory, where complex topics such as homophobia, mental illness, and teenage pregnancy are explored with a great measure of empathy and nuance. While not every entry is a success, the majority are interesting in their own unique ways, and even lay groundwork for new interpretations of the subgenre via the meta-framework present in Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which would go on to define the 90s and beyond with more commercially successful films such as Scream. The golden age of slashers is long gone, and in its wake are new stories, new frameworks, and new structures to interpret and critique. Thank you for watching.